Last night, something happened that you need to hear from beginning to end, because the truth your soulmate uncovered was not what either of you expected. It started with a question, not a question about love, not a question about the future of the relationship, not even a question about whether the two of you would eventually find your way back to each other. The question was about money. Your soulmate sat alone last night, carrying a strange mixture of curiosity, worry, and uncertainty. There had been something on their mind for days, maybe even weeks. They had been thinking about your life, your future, your responsibilities, and the way money seemed to keep appearing as a source of tension. Confusion, or unanswered questions. They wondered what was really happening with you. They wondered whether you were struggling more than you admitted. They wondered whether you were secretly preparing for a major change, and most importantly, they wondered whether your financial situation was connected to the distance that had grown between the two of you. That is when they decided to speak to a psychic. At first, they almost didn't do it. They stared at the phone, they opened the page, they closed it, they told themselves it was probably a ridiculous idea. They said, "I don't need somebody else telling me what I already know." But something kept pulling them back. It wasn't necessarily about believing every prediction they might hear. It was about needing answers. Your soulmate wanted to understand something they couldn't understand on their own. Why had your energy changed? Why did you seem more private? Why did you sometimes disappear emotionally even when you were physically present? Why did you seem like you were carrying something heavy? And why did money keep coming up whenever they thought about your future together? Eventually, they reached out. The psychic listened quietly. Your soulmate explained only a few details. They didn't tell the whole story. They didn't reveal everything about you. They didn't even give every detail about the relationship. They simply said that there was someone they cared about deeply. Someone they believed could be their soulmate, someone who had been acting differently lately. And then they asked the question, "What do you see around their money?" The psychic paused. That pause immediately made your soulmate uncomfortable. Then the psychic said something unexpected. "I'm not seeing someone who is simply having money problems." Your soulmate leaned closer to the screen. "What do you mean?" the psychic continued. "I'm seeing someone who has been thinking about money as security. Not luxury. Not status. Security." Your soulmate went silent, because suddenly, that description sounded familiar. The psychic said that your relationship with money appeared to be connected to something much deeper. Fear, responsibility, independence, and the desire to never feel powerless again. Your soulmate hadn't expected that. They had been thinking about bank accounts, bills, savings, work, and financial decisions. But the psychic was talking about emotions. The psychic explained that sometimes people become extremely private about money because money represents more than numbers to them. It can represent safety. It can represent freedom. It can represent the ability to leave a situation they don't want to remain in. It can represent the ability to protect someone they love, and sometimes it represents the fear of losing everything. Your soulmate suddenly realized something. Maybe they had been looking at your financial behavior from the wrong angle. Maybe when you pulled away, it wasn't because you didn't care. Maybe when you became quiet, it wasn't because you had stopped loving them. Maybe you were trying to figure out your life. Maybe you were trying to become stable before making promises. The psychic then asked a strange question. Does this person seem like they are preparing for something? Your soulmate didn't answer immediately, because the answer was yes. They had noticed it. You had been making different decisions. You had been thinking more carefully. You had become less impulsive. You seemed to be calculating everything. You weren't necessarily talking about what you were doing. But your behavior had changed, and that change had made your soulmate wonder whether something major was coming. The psychic said, "There is a financial decision connected to an emotional decision." That sentence hit differently. Your soulmate asked, "What kind of decision?" The psychic said they couldn't know the exact event, but the pattern suggested that money was not the destination. Money was the tool. Your soulmate asked what that meant. The psychic explained that your financial concerns appeared to be connected to wanting a different kind of life. Not necessarily a richer life, a freer life, a more peaceful life, a life where you didn't have to constantly worry about whether you could afford to make the choices your heart wanted. Your soulmate sat there thinking about you. They remembered conversations. They remembered moments when you had changed the subject after money came up. They remembered times when you seemed uncomfortable accepting help. They remembered how you sometimes acted as though asking for anything was a weakness. And then the psychic said something that completely changed the conversation. Your person may not be afraid of losing money. They may be afraid of losing control. Your soulmate froze. Because that was the part they hadn't understood. They had sometimes wondered why you seemed so determined to handle everything yourself, why you didn't simply ask for support, why you could be surrounded by people and still behave as though everything depended on you. The psychic said, "This person has learned to associate dependence with vulnerability." Your soulmate looked down. Suddenly, memories started connecting. Maybe you had experienced situations in the past where someone had used money to control you. Maybe you had watched people become trapped because they couldn't afford to leave. Maybe you had seen relationships change when finances became complicated. Maybe you had simply learned from life that nothing is guaranteed. The psychic didn't claim to know the exact details. Instead, they said something more important. Whatever happened before, your person doesn't want to repeat it. Your soulmate took a deep breath. Then came the question they had been afraid to ask. Does this mean they don't trust me? The psychic paused again. No, they said. It means they are trying to trust themselves. That sentence stayed with your soulmate, because maybe that was the real story. Maybe your soulmate had been taking your distance personally. Maybe they thought your silence meant rejection. Maybe they believed your caution meant you didn't see a future with them. Maybe they thought you were choosing money over love. But the psychic offered another interpretation. You may be seeing the outside behavior, they said, but you're not seeing the internal reason. Your soulmate asked what they should do. The psychic didn't tell them to chase you. They didn't tell them to pressure you. They didn't tell them to make dramatic promises. Instead, they said something simple. Talk to them. Your soulmate almost laughed. That's it. The psychic smiled. Sometimes the answer people search for in extraordinary places is sitting inside an ordinary conversation they are afraid to have. Your soulmate became quiet, because they knew there was a conversation they had been avoiding. A conversation about the future, a conversation about security, a conversation about what both of you actually wanted, and maybe, most importantly, a conversation about whether love could exist without either person feeling financially trapped or emotionally controlled. Then the psychic said something even more surprising. There's something they haven't told you. Your soulmate's attention immediately sharpened. What haven't they told me? The psychic explained that they couldn't know a private person's exact thoughts or facts without hearing them directly. But the situation suggested that you might be keeping a financial plan, goal, or concern to yourself, not necessarily because you were hiding something wrong, possibly because you were waiting until you felt ready. Your soulmate immediately thought about every time you had said, "I'll tell you when I know," every time you had delayed a decision, every time you had said you needed to figure something out first. Then the psychic said, they may be trying to build something before inviting you into it. Your soulmate's heart dropped, because that sounded like you. They remembered how you sometimes talked about wanting to get your life in order. They remembered you saying that you didn't want to make promises you couldn't keep. They remembered your insistence that love wasn't enough if two people couldn't create stability together. At the time, your soulmate may have interpreted those words as emotional distance. Now they were beginning to wonder if those words had actually been an expression of love. Maybe you didn't want to bring them into chaos. Maybe you wanted to solve certain problems before asking them to stand beside you. Maybe you believed that if you couldn't offer stability, you had no right to ask someone to build a future with you, and that realization hurt, because your soulmate suddenly wondered how many times they had misunderstood you. They asked the psychic, "Are they going to receive money?" The psychic didn't give a definite prediction. Instead, they said something more grounded. The important thing isn't whether money suddenly appears. The important thing is that their relationship with money is changing. That distinction mattered, because your future doesn't have to depend on some magical windfall. Sometimes financial change begins with a new decision, a new job, a new skill, a new opportunity, a better boundary, a plan, a conversation, a willingness to stop repeating old patterns. The psychic said, there is movement around their finances, but the bigger movement is inside them. Your soulmate listened. Then they asked the question that had been underneath everything else. Do they see me in their future? This time, the psychic didn't immediately respond. They said, your relationship appears to have emotional significance, but you should ask them directly rather than allowing anyone else to define your future. Your soulmate sat quietly, and for the first time that night, they understood the real lesson. The psychic wasn't supposed to tell them what you felt. No one could do that better than you. The psychic could offer perspective, but you were the person who held the truth. Your soulmate realized that they had been looking for certainty because uncertainty was uncomfortable. They wanted someone to tell them whether you would stay, whether you would return, whether you would become financially secure, whether the two of you would eventually build a life together. But the conversation had revealed something unexpected. The future wasn't Something they could discover by asking somebody else. It was something the two of you would have to create. Then the psychic said one final thing about your money. Don't mistake their caution for lack of ambition. Your soulmate looked confused. The psychic explained that sometimes people who appear slow are actually being extremely deliberate. They may be planning, saving, learning, waiting, preparing. They may not announce every step because they don't want outside opinions influencing their decisions. And your soulmate realized that perhaps you had been working quietly. Maybe you had been trying to improve your situation without telling everyone. Maybe you didn't want congratulations before the work was finished. Maybe you didn't want anyone to know about your plans until you could actually prove that they were real. That possibility changed everything, your soulmate asked. So what should I expect? The psychic answered, expect clarity, not necessarily instant wealth, not a guaranteed fortune, not a magical solution. Clarity, a clearer understanding of what you want, a clearer understanding of what you can afford, a clearer understanding of what kind of relationship you want, and a clearer understanding of what you're willing to accept. Your soulmate thanked the psychic. The conversation ended, but they didn't immediately go to sleep. They stayed awake, thinking about you, thinking about money, thinking about the future, thinking about every conversation that had gone unfinished, and eventually, they realized that the shocking part of the entire experience wasn't some prediction about your finances. It was the realization that your money situation might have been telling a completely different story than they thought. They had assumed money was creating distance. Maybe money was actually revealing your deepest desire for stability. They had assumed your silence meant you were hiding something. Maybe your silence meant you were protecting something you weren't ready to explain. They had assumed your independence meant you didn't need them. Maybe your independence meant you were afraid of needing anyone, and perhaps they had assumed that love and money were competing against each other. Maybe they were supposed to learn how to separate the two. Love should not become a financial transaction. Support should not become control. Money should not become proof of devotion. And a relationship should not depend on one person rescuing the other. Your soulmate realized that if there was going to be a future, it needed to be built differently, with honesty, with communication, with boundaries, with patience, and with respect for each other's independence. Meanwhile, you may have been completely unaware that any of this had happened. You may have been sleeping. You may have been going through your normal routine. You may have been thinking about completely different things. But while you were unaware, someone who cares about you was awake, trying to understand you. And maybe that's the part of this story you need to hear. Someone may be thinking about your future more seriously than you realize. Someone may be wondering how to approach you without making you feel pressured. Someone may be replaying old conversations and realizing they misunderstood what you were trying to say. Someone may be recognizing that your relationship with money isn't about greed. It may be about safety. It may be about independence. It may be about wanting to build a life where you never have to choose between love and security, and maybe your soulmate finally understands that. But there is another side to this. You don't have to prove your worth through money. You don't have to become financially perfect before you deserve love. You don't have to hide every struggle because you are afraid someone will see you differently, and you don't have to accept financial dependence just to prove that you care about someone. The healthiest future is one where both people can be honest. If you're struggling, you can say you're struggling. If you're building something, you can say you're building something. If you're scared, you can admit you're scared. If you have a plan, you can explain it when you're ready. And if you love someone, you don't have to communicate that love only through financial sacrifice. Your soulmate may have entered that psychic conversation looking for a prediction about your money. Instead, they walked away with a lesson about you. They realized that the numbers were never the whole story. The deeper story was about security, trust, fear, independence, and love. They realized that perhaps what you need isn't someone to save you. Perhaps you need someone who believes you are capable while still being willing to stand beside you. There is a difference, and that difference could change everything. So if you've been wondering why your soulmate seems different lately, why they seem quieter, more thoughtful, or strangely observant, there may be something happening beneath the surface. Maybe they are reconsidering old assumptions. Maybe they are realizing that they judged your behavior too quickly. Maybe they are preparing to have a conversation they should have had much earlier. And maybe they are finally beginning to understand that your financial journey is your own. They don't need to control it. They don't need to predict it. They don't need to fear it. They simply need to communicate with you. Because the biggest surprise from last night wasn't that a psychic supposedly saw something about your money. It was that your soulmate discovered a completely different way of looking at you. They discovered that your relationship with money might be connected to your relationship with yourself. And once they understood that, they began seeing your actions differently. The caution, the planning, the silence, the independence, the determination, the hesitation, all of it started making sense. Maybe you've been preparing for a new chapter. Maybe you've been trying to become more secure. Maybe you're learning to stop carrying everything alone. Maybe you're changing the way you think about money. Maybe you're deciding what kind of future you actually want. And maybe your soulmate is beginning to realize that if they want to be part of that future, they can't force their way into it. They have to earn trust. They have to listen. They have to respect your choices. They have to meet you as an equal. That is the real message hidden inside everything that happened last night. Not that a psychic can guarantee your future. Not that a sudden fortune is promised. Not that someone else knows your life better than you do. The real message is that something needs to become clearer. Your relationship with money. Your relationship with security. Your relationship with trust. And possibly your relationship with the person who has been thinking about you more deeply than you realize. Your soulmate asked about your money. But what they were really asking was, is there still a future for us? And perhaps they didn't get the simple yes or no they wanted. Instead, they got something much more valuable. They got a reason to stop guessing, a reason to stop assuming. A reason to stop interpreting every silence as rejection, and a reason to finally have the conversation, because your future cannot be built on predictions, it has to be built on choices. Your financial future will be shaped by the decisions you make, the opportunities you pursue, the people you trust, and the habits you develop. and your romantic future will be shaped by honesty, communication, mutual respect, and the willingness of two people to meet each other halfway, maybe last. Night was simply the moment your soulmate realized that, maybe they finally understood that they don't need to know everything about your future, they just need to know whether you're willing to be honest with them about the present. And maybe, when that conversation finally happens, you'll discover that the person you thought was pulling away was actually trying to find a way forward, not just for themselves, but for the possibility of building something meaningful with you. So don't let fear turn money into a wall between you and someone you care about. Don't let assumptions speak louder than honest conversations. And don't assume that someone's financial caution means their heart is closed. Sometimes people become careful because they care deeply about what they are building. Sometimes people become quiet because they don't want to make promises before they're ready. And sometimes the person who looks the most distant is actually the person spending the most time thinking about how to create a future that feels safe.